Let's review the topic of ritual and hierarchy. In this unit, we've seen that ritual often dramatizes social hierarchies that exist in the larger society, including hierarchies of social class, race and ethnicity, and we previously looked at ritual and gender. One thing we want to consider is whether rituals in certain cases bolster those hierarchies or whether they challenge them and attempt to transform society. Let's first look at James Howe's article on fox hunting as ritual. Howe argues that fox hunting in England is a ritual that both dramatizes and also reinforces a social hierarchy based on economic class. Various elements of it, expenses, vocabulary, social structure, and animal symbolism, all retrench hierarchy. Let's look at these in turn. According to Howe, the dramatization of social hierarchy within fox hunting starts with its vocabulary. Fox hunting involves an elaborate, specialized vocabulary that is used to describe the different people involved, the hounds, the different parts of the fox, and the different actions of all the hunters, hounds, and foxes. It is a vocabulary that is not known to the layperson, and consequently, knowledge of it marks fox hunters as special people. The high status of the vocabulary is not surprising, seeing as it is derived from French. French entered medieval England with the Norman invasion beginning in 1066, after which time French became the language of court, and it distinguished between the French-speaking Norman aristocrats and the Saxon peasants. French vocabulary became infused throughout many aspects of social life that were the preserve of royals and nobles, including hunting as a pastime, and familiarity with that refined vocabulary therefore in itself became a mark of cultural sophistication. In addition, for centuries, hunting as a pastime, and not just as a source of food, has been a sign of elite status in Europe. Hunting on horseback, in particular, was a sign of elite status because of the enormous expenses involved. Large sums are required to support the horses and the hounds, to buy the tack and riding gear, maintain the stables and kennels, and pay the servants who care for the horses and hounds. Further, the hunts traditionally take place in the middle of the week, and therefore simply participating in the hunt is a sign that one can afford the leisure. In the past in England, fox hunting often provided a way for a gentleman landowner to establish cordial relations with the tenant farmers who rented lands from him. Also, it was a way for men who had raised their fortunes through industry or commerce to assert a claim to gentleman status after they had purchased country estates. As Howe says, participating in the hunt and other so-called country pursuits would serve the function of, as he says on page 286, quote, demonstrating their detachment from the original sources of family wealth, their leisure, and their allegiance to rural values. And yet, riding with the hounds is very different from sponsoring the hunt, which is a task preserved for the wealthiest. The sponsor of a hunt is called the master, and the masters provide the hired hunt servant, the two whippers-in, other servants, and the pack of hounds. These servants direct the hounds and lead the hunt, while the other riders follow the hounds. Sponsoring large hunts, which also involved providing accommodations for large numbers of guests, according to Howe on page 287, quote, was itself an assertion of high status as the imperial head of a country, end quote. Howe quotes one observer on page 287 who remarked, quote, I would sooner be a master of hounds than a Lord Mayor. He is one of those who, in spite of the democratic tenderness of the age, may still be said to go about as a king among men. In England and Ireland in the 19th century, the entire countryside became divided up into different so-called countries, which were the areas covered by a hunt, and hunts would aim to cover the entire country in a season. Being master of a hunt and leading your packs and people through this entire area over the property and farms of all owners and tenants, therefore was a direct sign of one's status throughout that area. As Howe notes on page 288, quote, "It was generally assumed that hunters could ride where they wanted." End quote. Even today, he says on that same page, quote, "More land remains open than closed," end quote, and this is despite the damages frequently caused to property and crops by the horses and hounds. The consequences of closing one's land to hunters include social ostracism or, in the case of tenant farmers, eviction. Thus, leading a hunt, which traverses an entire rural region, is itself a sign of enormous social power. The skills involved in the hunt also aim to prove that those who enjoy the privileges of wealth in fact deserve them. The masters of the hunt and his direct servants control the hounds that chase the foxes, and so they use skills the riders do not. But even riding the horses at high speeds across rugged terrains is a very dangerous activity, one that requires enormous familiarity with and control over the horse. Engaging in these hunts, whether as masters or riders, then helps the elites to demonstrate their worth. Finally, the animals themselves help the elite to assert claims to high status. The horse and the hounds are both animals that, in Europe, have long been associated with aristocracy because of the costs of their care. In fact, the riders take care to call the animals hounds rather than the ordinary term dogs. Hunting hounds are very carefully selected, bred, and trained at great expense, and masters of the hunt typically maintain pedigree charts for their hounds. In addition, the fox itself marks the hunt as a high-status event. Medieval English hunters prized the wild boar and deer as the animals of highest status, as they were both large and the one fierce while the other stately. In fact, medieval European kings restricted deer hunting to the royals and nobles alone. However, those animals are no longer reliably available to English hunters as their habitat has been depleted, and so the fox hunt has become a substitute, since the fox is the only remaining wild animal in rural England that can be chased on horseback. For these various reasons, fox hunting in England remains a sign of elite status. To participate in the fox hunt, to allow the hunters and hounds to pursue a fox across one's land, or simply to follow the hunt on foot, these are all signs of a willingness to acquiesce to a social hierarchy based on economic class. As Howe says on page 296, quote, "Direct or at one remove, willing, induced, or coerced, their participation is taken as a conventional sign of acquiescence to the class structure represented and dramatized in the hunt." End quote. By way of comparison, in her article, Second Lines, Minstrelsy, and the Contested Landscapes of New Orleans Afro-Creole Festivals, Helen Regis argues that the second line parades create an alternative social order. They challenge existing social hierarchies. Regis refers to a spatial apartheid in which the city of New Orleans consists of severe social inequalities that are patterned spatially. Regis mentions white flight in New Orleans. Other social scientists have written extensively about this pattern and its documented effects. In New Orleans, as in the case of many U.S. cities, poverty and people of color are geographically concentrated in city centers. This pattern of racial and economic segregation is an effect of ongoing social processes, in a pattern endlessly repeated and self-perpetuating. When city residents reach a certain income level, they tend to move out of the cities to enjoy the comforts, large yards, fresh air, and high-quality school systems of the suburbs, what is often called white flight. Those who are left in the inner cities are those without the financial means to relocate to the suburbs. Businesses also move to the suburbs to cater to the wealthier residents, sucking jobs out of the inner cities and further entrapping the poor in a situation of lower employment. Regis notes that some of those in inner city New Orleans with less education and fewer job opportunities turn to criminal activities to earn a living, and consequently those trapped in the inner city are more likely to be victims of crime and to feel that their neighborhoods are dangerous. It may be said then that the inner city residents in New Orleans occupy the lowest rank in three social hierarchies: ethnic minority status, income, and also vulnerability to crime. She notes that insult is added to injury when mass media peddles in stereotypes of Black dangerousness, which retrenches racial segregation as white residents of the suburbs and wealthier parts of town are thereby frightened off from entering the working class neighborhoods. However, Regis notes that for the Black working class residents of New Orleans, the second line parades are a powerful way in which they attempt to push back against the dehumanizing effects of poverty, racial segregation, and criminal activity. They quite literally take back the streets. Every weekend throughout the year from August to May, different second line parades wend their way through the working class neighborhoods, creating a space for joy through the brass band music and dancers. Anyone and everyone can join in at the back of the parade. Their name comes from that openness as well. The first line is the band itself, and the second line are those who join in behind. These joyous parades sometimes go through neighborhoods where otherwise people do not feel welcome, such as wealthier neighborhoods or turf claimed by gangs. The social clubs that organize the parades intentionally try to root out crime and violence in their neighborhoods by giving youths alternatives to crime and warning residents not to spoil the parades by fighting or selling drugs. A subset of the second line parades is what are sometimes called jazz funerals or funeral processions, homegoing ceremonies for members of the social clubs. In a poignant passage, Regis describes the homegoing ceremony for a man named Nathaniel Kray, a very well-respected, dignified man who is said to have worked all of the time so that he could pay the dues to all of the social clubs in which he participated. His funeral procession went through the wealthier Garden District, which was otherwise not part of the space that he traversed on a day-to-day basis. The anniversary of his funeral was marked by a second procession in his honor, which invoked his memory and celebrated his life. She notes that, quote, "His life did not make the news. It is only through the local idiom of the second line that his life and death are publicized and remembered." The second line parades are more than symbolic. In everyday life, the streets of New Orleans are segregated and sometimes feel dangerous. During these weekly rituals, however, working-class Black New Orleanians take back the streets, transforming them into joyous, celebratory spaces in which everyone belongs and everyone is safe. They subvert hierarchies of race, income, and crime victimization and create for themselves experiences of dignity, safety, and moral order. A more ambiguous example is provided by the ritual offerings to the Dio in the silver mines in Potosi, as shown in The Devil's Miner. The rituals definitely reflect severe ethnic and global inequalities, but they do not seem to either glorify them or challenge them. We can establish, first of all, how the rituals reflect inequalities. Large-scale mining at Potosi was introduced by Spaniards in the colonial era, and the indigenous people were forced through a system called mita to work in the mines. The mines were so profitable that Potosi became the largest city in the Americas, even though it is located at over 13,000 feet in elevation. Mining here is extremely dangerous. The life expectancy of miners is between 35 and 40 years of age. Accidents are frequent, and inhaling the toxic dust causes most miners to develop silicosis of the lungs. The facts that today the miners are typically Quechua-speaking indigenous people, that they are given little protective equipment, and that they earn poverty-level wages show that the ethnic hierarchies from the colonial period have been reproduced over the generations and are now deeply entrenched. The boys have little chance of improving their lives through education because of the entry costs and because they must keep working to support their families. These facts ensure the ethnic hierarchies will continue to be reproduced for the foreseeable future. Now let's look at the ritual offerings. The ritual offerings to the Dio reflect those colonial hierarchies. In order to survive in the mines and to locate veins of ore, the miners give offerings and sacrifice llamas to the Dio, who is envisioned as a sort of lord of the underworld. The Dio expects such offerings, or he will take a sacrifice by killing a miner by causing an accident. The Dio is not a benevolent god, but he takes the form of the Christian devil, with horns, a tail, and often red eyes or skin. The Spaniards introduced Christianity, including ideas about the devil, to indigenous Bolivians at the same time that they put them to work in the silver mines. The malevolence of the Dio is also reflected in the kinds of things that he likes to receive: alcohol, coca, and tobacco. The lord of the underworld, who jealously guards riches, is therefore also led around by his vices. The Dio is not an object of affection, but rather of fear. The ritual offerings should not be read as adoration, but rather protection from evil. In that sense, we might say that the rituals not only reflect colonial hierarchies, but they comment on them, rendering moral judgment. Through these ritual offerings, the miners draw symbolic associations between the Spanish devil, the dangerousness of the mine, the hazards of poverty, and the vice of greed. The ritual offerings to the Dio therefore critique the ethnic and global hierarchies that are legacies of Spanish imperialism. But do they go beyond that, say, taking the next step to upend that social order? It doesn't seem that they do. The miners go back into the mines every day for work because there are few alternatives for them. In that sense, the rituals are impotent. They might help the miners feel safer momentarily, but that is all.